is America sliding towards illiteracy? I'll talk about that today. So I'm going to put a link in the description box below in this article. It's an article that was originally in the Atlantic, and there's also a forum that's on MSN, and it's very interesting, and the title of it is America is Sliding Towards Illiteracy. So illiteracy means not being able to read, and I've talked about this a lot on my channel if you look at my previous videos about some of the things that are going on in literacy, about how the test scores are going down for literacy nationwide and really worldwide, and some of the factors in that. But I want to go over this particular article because I have not seen an article that has gotten this much attention. This is all over my Facebook page. A lot of teachers particularly are sharing this article because it's very interesting. And secondly, it really covers just about everything, most things that are affecting literacy. It doesn't get into things like student behavior as much, but there is a little bit of tie-in in that, and I'll go into that. So the headline of this, the first line of it, to me, is just really telling. It says, the past decade may take as one of the worst in American history. So they're talking about education. So basically, there was a downhill slide in education starting in about 2013. Then, of course, COVID really accelerated everything. Some of the test data that I've actually looked at saw more of a slide like 2015, 2017. But something happened in the middle of the 2010s that started this slide. But basically, we're now at pretty much a crisis with reading. So our test scores are lower than they've ever been. And there's also a bigger gap between high students and most struggling students. Students who are in the top 10 percentile, in other words, students who do better than 90% of students in their grade. The test, the national test, those students are doing just as well as ever. In some measures, they're actually doing better than ever. It's those students at the very bottom who are really struggling. So we now have 33% of students in the United States who score below basic. In other words, they don't even have a basic foundation of literacy. They're what you might call functionally illiterate. That's a very big number. So why is this happening? So I want to go through some of the things that they talked about here. There's been this talk that schools are underfunded, and in some cases you might say they are, because compared to other things like our government in Washington, the Defense Department, yeah, schools don't get as much funding as that. The Defense Department can do just about anything with the money it has. It's pretty unlimited. Compared to that, schools get very little. Compared to, say, healthcare systems, schools get very little. But what's interesting is that there's been an increase in spending in most places in the United States. But that increase has not led to better test scores. Test scores keep on going down. So it's not all about the money. One thing that the article says is that after COVID, during the Biden administration, there was a lot of money given to schools to help schools get students back on track. In other words, to help students. It was designed to give money for things like tutoring and extra help and support and instruction because students have missed so much school. But that money was largely wasted. A lot of that went to things like capital improvements, so schools, facilities, buildings, things that schools should be able to afford and usually couldn't because, again, funding for schools is not as big as some other things. But one thing that they mentioned that I've been saying for a long time is that smartphones coincided with this decline. So if you think about it, I got my first smartphone, I believe, in 2012. I was a little bit late compared to most people I knew. But in 2011, only 23% of teens had smartphones. In other words, phones where you can surf the web, you have all these social media devices, social media sites. That was in 2011, it was only 23% of teens. But by 2018, it was 95%. So during about 2013 to 2018, smartphones took off, and that's about when we start to see the slide. And there's a lot of research about how bad smartphones are for the brain and for social skills and for mental health and a lot of things with the children. And I would add to that, and he said this doesn't make sense. It can't be the only reason because younger children are seeing the slide too. I'm hesitant with that argument that it can't just be smartphones, or that can't be the primary reason, because younger kids are getting devices very young. I'm a mom now, and I'm getting all the time ads on my social media accounts and ads when I'm looking at something on the internet, advertising for all these apps for kids that go on tablets. So I saw one yesterday for a speech app, which is pretty unbelievable, because part of the reason why children are being referred for, especially for speech problems today, speech and language problems, it has to do with the rise of technology. So that's pretty interesting. But they had this app for speech where you give 2 or 3 year olds a tablet, and it's supposed to help them improve their speech. I get all these apps for kindergarten readiness, all these things that are interactive, that are fun, where students pick answers and it's adaptive. And the studies show that's really bad for the brain. And even school systems will give children tablets now. Most children starting in kindergarten will have tablets now, and that's a lot of times funded with federal money, which may go away now. I don't know, it may not. But that we're seeing tablets and devices even for young children. So I think that this could be a very, very big factor. It's probably not the only factor, because again, this is a worldwide thing. We're seeing it all over, but that's probably one of the big factors, and all the things that go with that. One thing that they mentioned was low expectations. This article mentioned was low expectations, and we definitely are seeing that. So I just learned today that in British Columbia, Canada, which is one of the biggest provinces in Canada, that it's kind of an understanding based on policy that students can't fail, that there has to be a big reason for a student to fail, and there have to be all these intervention plans to get a student not to fail. And I was talking to someone who lives in Canada, who's a parent, and she was saying this is just really difficult to deal with, because kids could do anything. They cannot turn a single thing in, and yet they won't fail them. They have no consequences as far as grades that occurs failing. And here in the United States, we're seeing softer expectations also. Here in South Carolina and in several other states also, it's gone from a 7-point grading scale to a 10-point grading scale. So what that means in practice is that it used to be that you had to have a 70 to pass a course. Now you only have to have a 60, and it's much easier to get a higher score than it was in the past. And so I actually saw an article on this for when it was passed, and these student athletes are really excited because for their scholarships they needed to have higher grades. And that's just an example for me of how we've gotten way off the purpose of academics and the purpose of grading. It's not the student earning them, it's that they're supposed to help the student to get to where they go. Everything's about making it easier for the student, not necessarily helping the student to learn the things that they need, which to me says something about our society. And that's something that we're seeing globally as well. And in 40% of middle schools in the United States, there are no late fees, and you can't give zeros, and there are limited redos. This is pretty normal in schools now. There's this idea of equity, and it's the same idea that they have in Canada, because there's this belief that students all come from different places, and they've got different strengths and different abilities, and it isn't fair to judge everyone equally because they have different resources. And I get that, but I also get that there has to be some kind of accountability. He also mentioned intervention policies, and the 2 states that were mentioned that actually kind of buck this trend, that are actually doing better, are Mississippi and Louisiana, which are not traditionally states that have done well academically, but they have intervention policies that are really good for students. In other words, they help the students who are struggling the most. And that's something that's kind of been left out of this discussion. I've said in another video, I've worked at schools before that had really good intervention programs, and it's been absolutely amazing what you can do. But it's hard, so a lot of school systems don't want to do that. He talks about charter schools, and I disagree with that, because there's kind of a mixed evidence about charter schools. But what was not mentioned in this whole article was how students are not reading, which kind of ties together a lot of these factors. The fact that there are less expectations. Students aren't expected to read. That students aren't reading anymore. Instead, they're on their smartphones watching TV, or they're watching a video, or they're on a web page. And schools are being encouraged to do this instead of reading now, because again, it's considered more engaging than reading. And also for tests, teachers are only teaching excerpts of books, or they only use selected passages, because during the test, there are only passages of tests, because tests have so much to go through that they're not going to have a really long passage and have the student use that, generally, particularly standardized tests that you take at the end of the year. So that's what I think is left out of this article, is that students aren't reading as much, and we're even seeing that at college, that students are unprepared in reading, that many times students are given a long text and they can't do that. So overall, I thought that this was really well written, and I feel like it's something that really society needs, because it's written in a way that's concise, that's easy for people to understand, but it really does point to a lot of the factors in education that are causing this problem. So I want to know what you think. What do you think are the causes of the reading crisis? Please comment below, and please like and subscribe. Until next time, keep learning.